There is a feeling amongst certain sections of our communities that there are not equal protections in law for people of different communities, different faiths and different backgrounds.
Lord Bracadale found that there was widespread support for legislation to deal with online and physical hate crimes towards women and has recommended a statutory aggravator in that regard.
So what does it mean for individual police officers? What does it mean for the Procurator Fiscal when it's implementing any legislation? What does it mean for individual lawyers or judges? What does it mean for any potential victims?
The most important thing I would say is that law has got to be effective, and the lesson from the Offensive Behaviour at Football Act is that you had a badly drafted piece of legislation, and it was an example of a government that was reaching too far, and unfortunately that reach therefore went all the way out into the state in terms of how the police actually operated. The reality was that football fans were treated like second-class citizens.
A lot of people who will look at the hate crime legislation will look at it and think this is an attempt to curb freedom of speech. I believe in the protection of freedom of speech, but what we are talking about is the freedom to offend, the freedom to abuse, and the freedom to hold prejudiced views.
The amount of money that was used in pursuit of people under the Offensive Behaviour at Football Act, much of it was wasteful. And the reality of that legislation was that it took many people into the criminal justice system for the very first time. And many of those cases didn't end up reaching the courts, or people were ultimately found not guilty.
This video is a response to the Scottish Government's call for views on the proposed Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Bill. Specifically, this submission will address the Scottish Government's recent public commitment to develop a standalone offence of misogynistic harassment. Drawing on evidence documented in Lord Bracadale's independent review of Hate Crime in Scotland report, I will explain why it is that I believe that the Scottish Government's current position is tainted by sex discrimination and demonstrates a flagrant disregard and possible intolerance towards Scottish boys and men. Over the next few minutes, I will seek to highlight 7 specific reasons why, in my humble subjective opinion, the current proposal is a really bad idea. Reasons that include the lack of public support for hate crime law in Scotland generally, the overwhelming lack of public support for a sex hostility aggravation, the political and discriminatory nature of support for a standalone misogyny aggravation, the misleading nature of the Scottish Government's assessment of gendered trends in relation to online abuse, the misleading nature of Lord Bracadale's assertion that the practical impact of gender-based offending falls almost exclusively on women, the current lack of evidence of possible gaps in existing law that might reasonably be addressed by the proposed offence of misogynistic harassment, and current confusing and contradictory Scottish public policy positions on misogyny and crimes categorised as gender-based violence. Number 1. Lack of public support for hate crime law. An analysis of consultation responses submitted to the independent review shows that there is only limited support for hate crime laws amongst the general public in Scotland, with the significant majority of respondents, 73%, indicating that they did not support this legislation. I cannot support hate crime legislation for the same reasons highlighted by the majority group of respondents to Lord Bracadale's review. These include concerns that they are too subjective and open to abuse, that they endanger important human rights such as freedom of speech and political or religious expression, that they create different classes of victims of crimes and the perceived privileging of some groups in society over others, that they are divisive and create or reinforce subgroups within society, that the law should offer the same level of protection to all individuals, that there is a reportedly low number of hate crimes recorded in Scotland annually, that they do not appear to offer an effective way of dealing with hatred and intolerance, and that they place excessive strains on the police and criminal justice systems. The law, the courts and the police public service should provide the same level of protection and regard to all people with protected characteristics as outlined in the Equality Act 2010. The Scottish Government's commitment in principle to legislate against crime perceived to be motivated by or demonstrating hatred against one sex only can reasonably be perceived to be an act of direct sex discrimination. I would caution against such a discriminatory action, given that the outworkings of such legislation may inevitably lead to legal challenges, particularly in relation to equality duties that public authorities such as the Police Scotland and the Crown Office are bound by. Furthermore, based on evidence outlined in the rest of this paper, I would be concerned that the Scottish Government's current position on the matter is tainted by and clearly demonstrates a flagrant disregard towards and even possible prejudice against Scottish boys and men. Number 2, lack of support for a sex hostility statutory aggravation. In the final report of the independent review of hate crime legislation in Scotland, Lord Bracadale made the following claim. Although the consultation responses did not demonstrate any clear consensus on the general principle of extending hate crime legislation, there was strong support among both individual and organisational respondents for some kind of provision relating to gender or misogyny. This is in fact a deeply disingenuous and misleading assessment of a consultation process that involved public meetings across Scotland and the submission of over 450 written responses. An analysis of consultation responses clearly show that 91% of respondents to question 14 did not support the proposal to extend a standalone charge to other groups. Indeed, only 9% of all individuals or organisations responding spoke in favour of such an extension, compared to 85% who directly spoke against it. The majority of responses to question 29 presented the reoccurring view that specific legislation should not be created to deal with offences involving malice or ill will based on additional characteristics, including sex. Furthermore, the appearance of widespread support for some kind of provision relating to sex appears to have been based on the specific responses of approximately 30 organisations and a small number of individuals. Number 3, politically motivated support for misogyny statutory aggravation. The proportion of respondents to the independent review who supported the statutory aggravation for sex hostility, 9%, is similar in size to the estimated 7% of people in the UK who the Fawcett Society estimate self-identify as feminist. Similarly, the proportion of the population estimated to want and support equality for and between both sexes, 83%, is similar to the proportion of respondents who specifically rejected the independent review's sex hostility proposal. This is significant for 2 reasons. Firstly, the perceived need for a statutory aggravation for sex hostility has largely been created by a relatively small number of self-identifying feminist lobby groups.
What we're talking about here isn't turning anything into a crime that isn't already illegal. We're talking about the fact that women already experience extremely high levels of abuse, crime, assault that is motivated by misogyny, but at the moment they just don't feel empowered to report it, and this could change that.
Secondly, this minority interest grouping have actively lobbied against extending the scope of hate crime law in a manner consistent with the non-discrimination principle and the equal provision of protection for all people with protected characteristics. I believe that this position demonstrates a clear lack of regard towards boys and men, to the extent that it could reasonably be perceived to be motivated by hostility towards people solely on grounds of their sex. Given the evidence documented during the independent review and Lord Bracadale's conclusions, it is both extraordinary and alarming that the Scottish Government have signalled support in principle for a standalone statutory aggravation of misogyny. Number 4, the Government government's misleading assessment of online abuse trends. The independent review placed a significant amount of emphasis on the perceived prevalence of online abuse. Indeed, this emerging issue was cited by Lord Bracadale as one of two main reasons why offending shown to involve sex hostility should be covered by new hate crime legislation. Lord Bracadale's assertion that the practical impact of this form of offending falls almost exclusively on women is deeply troubling and appears to be entirely based on submissions from a relatively small number of respondents, representing special interest groups whose actions have demonstrated very little regard and concern for boys and men. Consequently, I would be deeply concerned that the Scottish Government's current position on the frequency and impact of online abuse appears to be based entirely on research that specifically excludes boys and men from the scope of inquiry. The adoption of such an approach means that approximately 70% of current estimated hate crime victim populations will have been removed from available data samples before researchers sought to find any evidence of problematic or abusive behaviours online. From an intersectional perspective, this means that the online experiences of significant populations of black and minority ethnic, LGBT, disabled and young men have been entirely ignored, all of whom are understood to disproportionately experience high incidence of hate crime.
What makes me angry when I read that kind of abuse about me is I worry that it's putting the next generation of young women off politics. So I feel a responsibility to challenge it, not so much on my own behalf, but on behalf of young women out there who are looking at what people say about me and thinking, I don't want to ever be in that position.
The toxic Twitter report, publicly championed by the First Minister and featured prominently in the Independent Review's report, is a good example of this approach. Both its and related Amnesty International research cited by the Independent Review exclusively focused on abusive comments directed towards female public figures. Comparatively, studies that adopted a gender-inclusive methodology have consistently shown that male public figures experience online abuse at significantly higher rates when compared to female politicians. These include research published by Demos, the BBC, Hereford University and Sheffield University.
I mean, politicians, this is a controversial statement, politicians are human. Politicians who've tried to say that kind of comment, whether they're reading it on Twitter or in the Daily Mail, that it doesn't affect them at all, I think are not being entirely honest.
Furthermore, research by Ofcom shows that more generally, women and men experience relatively similar levels of online harms, including hate speech. And two American studies by the Pew Research Center found similar trends in relation to the sex of online users. Number 5, perceived gaps in the law. The other factor Lord Bracadale pointed to in support of his recommendation to create a sex hostility aggravation was what he described as a significant cultural shift in the sense that women are not now prepared to tolerate sexual harassment that might have been put up with in the past. He then acknowledges that in recent years the Scottish Parliament has passed a large amount of criminal law which can be used to tackle harassment and violence against women and girls. He also notes that this suite of offences appear to work effectively, are kept under review in terms of the Scottish Government's Equally Safe strategy, have been amended and updated as necessary, and he concludes that the arguments generally made in favour of hate crime legislation appear to be less relevant in the context of this type of focused offence, observing that the offences implicitly involve the concept of gender. They are already treated very seriously by society, so the penalties imposed reflect this. It might therefore be concluded that there is no need to send an additional message through hate crime legislation that the conduct is unacceptable. Based on this, my understanding is that the purpose of the proposed creation of a misogyny statutory aggravation may be primarily to address possible gaps in the law, or to address crimes that could be dealt with more effectively by the criminal law than it is at present. To date, neither the Scottish Government nor the Independent Review have identified what these possible gaps may be. If specific gaps in criminal law can be identified and shown to disadvantage women and girls, or any other protected group for that matter, then it is likely I could support appropriate legislative change. However, even in this circumstance, I believe that it would not be appropriate to address such gaps in hate crime laws clause that primarily exists to allow statutory aggravation when sentencing perpetrators of existing crimes.
What we're talking about here isn't turning anything into a crime that isn't already illegal.
We can't apply a hate crime tariff to something that isn't already a hate crime. This isn't about criminalising wolf whistling or flirting. It's about recognising existing crimes that are motivated by hostility towards somebody for their gender because of what they are, hate crimes.
Number 6, Lord Brackadale's flawed assessment of gender-based offending. Lord Brackadale's assertion that the practical impact of gender-based offending falls almost exclusively on women would appear to be supported by the Scottish Government. However, I've already highlighted gendered trends relating to online abuse which show this to be untrue. In addition, I would draw your attention to the Fawcett Society's analysis of Home Office estimates of crimes in England and Wales, broken down by perceived motivating hostility. Their analysis found that in crimes perceived to have been motivated by sex, 15% of victims were identified as male. Furthermore, I would note that while many male victims may not feel comfortable disclosing this perspective, or indeed may not perceive their sex to be relevant to their experience of crime, statistical trends indicate that the sex of the victim may be a direct motivating factor in the perpetration of many crimes. Boys and men are significantly more likely to be the victims of violent crime when compared to women and girls. It is likely that to at least some degree this consistent trend is impacted by profound cultural intolerance of and taboos against violence targeting women or girls.
Real men don't hit women.
Violence against women and girls is one of the most devastating and fundamental violations of human rights.
Number 7. The government positions on misogyny and violence against women and girls are both confusing and contradictory.
We're talking about the fact that women already experience extremely high levels of abuse, crime, assault that is motivated by misogyny.
There is a commonly held perception that if introduced, a sex hostility statutory aggravation will ultimately be used to enhance the sentence of perpetrators of crimes currently categorised as gender-based violence under Scotland's equally safe strategy for preventing and eradicating violence against women and girls.
There's 127 programmes addressing violence against women and girls.
Record levels of funding to tackle violence against women.
Violence against women and girls.
Violence against women and girls.
Violence against women and girls.
Violence against women.
Violence against women.
Violence against women is rooted in women's inequality.
Although the independent review report appeared to indicate that this may not be the case, it is clear that the highly influential group of feminist lobbyists do view misogyny to be a root cause of all crimes categorised as gender-based violence. Indeed, Equally Safe, Scotland's strategy for preventing and eradicating crimes categorised as violence against women and girls, is informed by the Scottish Government's own belief that women and girls have a subordinate status in Scottish society, and that gender-based violence is a function of gender inequality and abuse of male power and privilege, and that such violence cannot be understood in isolation from the norms, social structure and gender roles within the community.
At the heart of this is inequality, and societies where women and girls continue to be unequal in social, economic and political realms, where they are powerless, limited or restricted, cannot fully challenge and change this culture.
Men's power in society and the hold that they have in that power, displayed in the relationships that exist between men and women. Men are still the dominant sex in almost every area of society.
What that means, of course, is violent and abusive behaviour directed at women and girls precisely because they are women and girls. And I'm saddened to say that this behaviour is predominantly carried out by men and often stems from systematic, deep-rooted women's inequality.
Confusingly, it is also widely understood that Scottish boys and men can and frequently do experience crimes categorised as violence against women and girls. Boys and men may not experience these crimes as frequently as women and girls tragically do. Nevertheless, every year, significant numbers of boys and men can and do experience crimes such as domestic abuse, sexual violence, forced marriage and online violence. Such victims are poorly served by government policy impacted by the confusing, contradictory and controversial concept of gender-based violence.
Gender-based violence.
Gender-based violence affects the whole family.
Gender-based violence.
Gender-based violence.
Gender-based violence across the world.
Gender-based violence.
Gender-based violence.
Gender-based violence is constant.
Gender-based violence.
Gender-based violence. Gender-based violence.
Gender-based violence.
Gender-based violence against women and girls.
The Scottish Government has no complementary strategy with the ambition to eradicate violence against boys and men, and as a consequence, male victims of crimes categorised as violence against women and girls are essentially made invisible by this approach. They're also often directly discriminated on grounds of sex by the publicly funded service provision arrangements that flow from such a uniquely gendered public policy.
I understand between 2015-17 alone, 24 million has been invested from the Equalities portfolio to support a range of projects and initiatives, including a range of frontline specialist services working with women and children who have experienced domestic abuse.
This approach has largely been moulded by the demands of the same minority lobby that have directly profited both politically and financially from this strategy. A strategy that disproportionately ring-fences resources for the exclusive benefit of one class of victim based solely on sex, while at the same time diminishing the experience and visibility of a perceived second class of victims, who are consequently doubly disadvantaged by a policy that directly discriminates against them solely on the basis of their sex.
Judges must, I now believe, attend training on this issue. Judges must address emotional abuse by men. Judges must now defend women.
In this context, the proposed misogyny statutory aggravation has the potential to further diminish the visibility and rights of male victims of crimes currently categorised as violence against women and girls. Its similarly one-sided construct will also inevitably contribute to an increase in the already substantial disparity in crime sentencing that male perpetrators of crime experience when compared to their female peer group.
Let's go look at that jacket. Oh! What do you think, Mary Hen?
Oh, you've made a lovely job of that, Ella, so you have.
Aye. Always like to stab him down the seam. It makes him ending easier.
Ladies and gentlemen, violence against women is an abomination. I would like to call it crime against humanity. It stands against everything in the United Nations Charter.
On March the 8th, 2008, then United Nations Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon made the following observation that is quoted in the introduction to the Scottish Government's Equally Safe strategy. There is one universal truth applicable to all countries, cultures and communities. Violence against women is never acceptable, never excusable, never tolerable. I support both the sentiment and the reality of that statement. Sadly, I also fully anticipate that submissions such as this will ultimately be ignored and possibly even perceived by some as somehow misogynistic, and that any action or inaction will ultimately be progressed based on the demands of a small cross-section of publicly funded lobby groups. This conclusion is based on the fact that despite the overwhelming rejection of the proposal by respondents to the 2018 consultation, the Scottish Government have already publicly committed to developing a standalone offence which would criminalise serious misogynistic harassment, whatever that actually means. It is also based on the Scottish Government's deeply discriminatory strategy for supporting vulnerable victims of violent crime currently categorised as violence against women and girls. Sadly, at least in my humble subjective opinion, such actions signal a clear message to Scottish society. That message is that hatred and violence against boys and men is acceptable, excusable and to be tolerated within Scottish communities, to an extent that hatred or violence against women, thankfully, is not.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.